Yes, Lilian is here now. Okay, it's up to you, Lilian, now for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I apologize. For some reason, I do not know why it froze while I was trying to get on earlier. This is a paper co-authored with Ray Dai from WURS and Ritwan, who's at WU Vienna University, and Howlian at SMU. It's a paper on outsourcing climate change. What I'm going to do here is to sort of give you some sense of what I mean from, let me see what I mean. Okay, let me just get my thing going. Okay, so I'm going to start off with talking about what are the extreme weathers of that are hallmark of climate change. The August 2021 report of the UN IPCC warns that pollution caused by humans has led to an increase in extreme weather events such as heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts, and tropical cyclones. So if you look at British Columbia, these last 2 weeks, they were experiencing catastrophic floods and mudslides. Last July, they have the hottest month at record history, with Lilian hitting 49.6 degrees. So the weather was very volatile. There were wildfires following that heat waves. And I was just looking at some of the extreme weather events in New Zealand. This is a conference hosted by a university in New Zealand. So New Zealand has experienced an increase of 1.3 degrees since 1910, and had more coastal flooding due to melting glaciers and rising sea levels. And it has a high number of days per year with extreme fire risk. One example is 2017 fire on the Port Hills in Christchurch, which I had not been. I've been to New Zealand, but not to Christchurch. I heard it's beautiful. And experienced more frequent and longer dry spells. Not to forget the cattle and sheep, they contributed about 44% of the agricultural greenhouse emissions in New Zealand. So after having said that, let me just give you some definitions so you can understand my study better. We define the greenhouse gas footprint using scopes 1, 2, and 3, which are defined by the GHG protocol. What these direct, there will be scope 1 is the direct, i.e. the emissions that are produced by the firm itself. Scope 2 emissions produced when the firm has to buy electricity, steam, heating, and cooling for their own use. So there are 2 types of scope 3. Scope 3, the indirect ones, will be the one which is a supplier-induced emissions, and the other downstream scope 3 emissions, the indirect, will be the ones that use the emissions produced by end users. So what we're going to do is we are going to look at mainly scope 3 emissions. But before I do that, let me discuss about what the corporate efforts have been in reducing GHG emissions. Besides the laws, regulations, and taxations, corporations have played a very important and proactive role in reducing GHG emissions. Microsoft, for example, has said they have been carbon neutral since 2012. Amazon is targeting a net zero carbon footprint by 2040. And some of the couple of studies have shown that firms shift their emissions to less regulated countries in order to reduce their emissions in local markets. However, much of the attention focuses only on firm scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which will be the direct emissions and the indirect produced by electricity, heating, and gas. Most of the studies have not done is to look at the supply chain induced indirect emissions that we are going to focus today. So for the case of motivation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use P&G, Procter & Gamble. I'm not sure whether it's available in New Zealand. They have the Charming toilet rolls. If you look at the way they manufacture toilet rolls from trees to toilet paper, P&Gs have agreed or make a public climate commitment to reduce their annual emissions by 50% by 2030. A study that was featured by the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is a NGO, what they have found is that from the production of raw materials to the disposal of products, P&G produces about 250 million metric tons of GHG annually. However, if they are planning to, they have climate change, the climate commitment pretty much focus on scopes 1 and 2, which consists about 4.3 million tons. Having this GHG target only amounts to 2% of its total emissions level, so which is very small, relatively speaking. So what we have done is we look at the sample of all this whole sample of US firms, and we are focusing on looking at the direct and supplier-induced emissions. So if you look at the blue line, this is the direct emissions relative to the total emissions produced by the firm, which is scope 1, 2, and 3. And the orange line is the proportion of the supplier-induced emissions. So if I were to look at the sample of US firms that we study in our analysis, the scope 3 emissions actually comprise of about 69% of the total emissions a firm emits. So it is a huge number, relatively speaking. That's the reason why it is incorrect not to factor in scope 3 emissions when a firm commit to reduce carbon emissions in general. Now, if I were to bring in imports into the picture, and you see that the imports increase over time, at the same time as the increase in the total emissions. So there is some sign that firms have been exporting the pollution overseas. So our study is going to look at how they imports clean products and then export their pollution overseas. So the research questions we're looking at, one is how do US firms combat climate change? We're asking ourselves, do they curb scope 1 emissions by outsourcing their climate pollution to suppliers overseas, resulting in climate leakage? And what are the mechanisms that drives firms' behavior? Last and not least, the questions we're going to ask is, what are the real and financial implications of firms' actions? We have used a whole repertoire of data sources that are available to us. The main database is TrueCost. I believe Fraser used CDP. TrueCost will use part of CDP, which will be scope 1 and 2 emissions. They also have their own estimated as well as firms disclose scope 3 emissions. So TrueCost collects company environmental data from a variety of publicly disclosed sources. They also use financial statements, and those statements, those information that is published on the company websites and other public resources. So what we have, our study uses firm level scope 1, 2, and upstream scope 3 emissions. The reason is that the downstream is smaller and it's much more challenging to estimate. And the next major database we use is Panjiva. It's also produced by S&P Global. It gives us the granularity of the import and export details of commercial shipment worldwide. So we are able to get the individual firms shipment from all of the countries. And I'm going to mention how many in a minute. So our sample excludes imports from foreign subsidiaries. And the reason is the foreign subsidiaries will be the emission produced by foreign subsidiaries will be scope 1 under the firm. So we do not want to double counting the amount of emissions produced by the firm. And we also use REPRIS, which is firm level ESG reputational risk data. We also include 12 different other data sources. The important one would be FactSet Review, which is the supply chain data that we need. And we also have the PACStat, which is a patent data. With this, let me go to the final sample that we have. It consists of 1,600 unique US firms, covering about 76,000 firm country year observations. And we are looking at suppliers from 210 countries worldwide. The sample period covers between 2007 and 2018. We start off with a very simple linear model where we have scope 3 on the left-hand side and the scope 1, which is the key variable on the right-hand side. We have the usual standard control variables, which are assets, Tobin's Q leverage, ROA, sales growth, tangibility, R&D, expenditure total, relative to total assets. And we also factor in the different combinations of fixed effects to rule out any omitted variables, i.e. we have firm plus country plus year, we have firm plus country times year, or firm times country time plus year. So with this, what I'm going to mention first is that we measure scope 1 and 3 emissions in the following way. We use the natural log of 1 plus scope 3, or we use the ratio of scope 3 relative to the total emissions. So we measure the 2 scope emissions in the 2 different ways, and I'll show you why we're going to do that. Now, the first set of results is, that appear in table 2 of our paper is that we have columns 1, 2, 3 will be scope 3 emissions. And the proportion is of columns 4, 5, 6. Now, if you measure the economic significance of these results, a 1 standard deviation increase in tons of scope 1 emissions for its mean would lead to an approximately 19% increase in upstream scope 3 emissions. So with beta being less than 1, the implication is that when firm reduces its own emissions, the supplier will reduce it, but at a slower speed. Now, you may challenge me and say, well, look at scope 1 and 3, it goes up. When scope 1 goes down, scope 3 goes down. But what about scope 1? It could go up and scope 3 could go up as well. So there is no direction in that sense. So what we did was we look at the proportion here. So the proportion would be columns 4 to 6. It is negative. The implication is there is a substitutional effect between scope 1 and 3 emissions, i.e., then the question is whether it is mechanical or outsourcing. And we're going to prove to you with various data analysis that it is indeed outsourcing. So what we have is we introduce imports into the picture to show that the firms export pollution to the foreign countries and import the green products back to their home country. In this case, it's the US. And we measure imports in 3 different ways. We look at it in terms of volume, in terms of the container, number of containers, and the number of counts. And the beta S here is a CSR activities, i.e. that when scope 1 goes up, scope 3 will go up. If I looking at an earlier paper, there was my paper with 2 other co-authors on this paper published in JFE in 2021. We showed that the standard of CSR of the customer is always imposed on the supplier. So this is the beta S is consistent with the earlier paper that we did. And the beta SI here has to be, if it's negative, it implies that the imports have been playing a mitigating role in this particular setting. So if you look at the regressions results here, they're all negative, consistent with our expectations that a 1 standard deviation increase in imported shipment volume from its mean will weaken. That means the scope 1 and 3 correlation will be weakened by about 2%, i.e. that an increase in scope 1 will be reduced by scope 3, or I should say the other way around, is that when a firm reduces their scope 1 emissions, it is at the expense of increasing scope 3 emissions produced by their suppliers overseas. So this is a substitutional relationship, which is further augmented by imports. Obviously, the next concern is identification strategies. There is endogeneity concerns, whether the results are driven by production cost considerations rather than outsourcing carbon emissions. We have implemented several exogenous shocks and US incentives to outsource emissions. We use a legislative pressure. We look at state legislative pressure, i.e. Analyze the shocks to congressional voting patterns in climate change related environmental issues to capture domestic legislative pressure. The shocks will be any increase in the pattern at least 3 times of the average over the years. Excuse me. We also look at the close call Congress elections, i.e. it is pretty much like a randomly assigned outcome where the close elections will be within 5% of the vote share between the winning and the runner-up candidates. So we also have looked at the placebo test that I'm going to show you. The second set of results, we look at regulatory stringency. We look at the state level stringency, i.e. examine state and enacted GHG emission targets to reduce statewide carbon output. We also look at on-site facility inspections that conducted by EPA. So we have a triple interaction models that we use in this paper, where the beta SI is the interaction term that of interest to us. And it captures the incremental impact or impulse on the Scope 1-3 association as driven by firms' incentives to outsource emissions overseas. So if it's a beta SI1 is negative, implies that a greater drop in the proportion of a firm's own emissions relative to the decrease in the overseas suppliers' emission. That means there is a stronger effect of emissions outsourcing. And treat is just a binary indicator, equal 1 if the state, where the firm is residing in the particular state experiencing a shot in year T-1 and 0 otherwise. So the results are consistent in the sense that they're all negative. And we also did a falsification test using Republican. As we all know, Republicans are not for climate change as opposed to Democrats. And the Republican, we have no results here. We look at the stringency, the same thing. At T-, when there is a shock here, there's a negative impact. But if we look at using a falsification test, we look at T-2, there's no result at all. So our test basically shows causality effect on the imports that would outsource, firms are outsourcing their pollution overseas. We look at cross-sectional analysis. We found that outsourcing is stronger when firms are from polluter industries or firms are from low enforcement environmental regulation scores or with lower stringency. Now let's look at the mechanism, which are one of the key findings here.
Lilian,
sorry.
Time is over, so can you go to conclusion, please?
Okay. All right, let me just tell you that we have two types of stakeholders. The internal one for outsourcing, and the external basically try not to outsource the climate change. So after having said that, I apologize, I took a longer time here. We also look at the real and financial implications. We found that there is a real implications as well as the financial implications. To wrap up this paper, what I'm going to show, I want to say is that the US corporations actually play whack-a-mole with pollution by reducing pollution in domestic markets at the expense of increasing emissions abroad. Firms outsource emissions to their suppliers, those with less green innovation, and then the emissions outsourcing is not fully priced in their pricing. So what we are trying to say is that you're going to reduce carbon footprint. It has to be reduced throughout the whole supply chain. Diversing pollution is not a good idea. And climate change has to be a global issue, i.e. a quest for international cooperation to achieve global carbon neutrality. All right, thank you. I thought I had 20 minutes, but probably I was wrong.
Thank you, Lilian.
Let me close this for you.
So your paper will be discussed by Fraser Holdings.
Let me stop sharing. Thank you.
Fraser?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I just want to start off by saying congratulations to Lilian and her team. One of the more airtight papers that I've read, really strong empirical paper. So going over the summary, so the motivation, firms are setting decarbonisation targets and trying to look at meeting their decarbonisation targets, etc. But they're just kicking the can down the road by increasing Scope 3 emissions. So the goal of the paper is to identify firms outsourcing carbon emission, which firms are doing it, what are the internal, external drivers, and what are the consequences or what are the reasons that firms are doing it. The sample looks at US firms from 2007 to 2018, 76,000 firm year observations from 1,500 firms and 210 import companies. So a large breadth of data and covers such a wide range. So very impressive. So the key findings are a firm's Scope 1 emissions are strongly correlated with their Scope 3 emissions. A firm's imports attenuate the positive correlation between its Scope 1 and upstream Scope 3 emissions. So US firms reduce their direct carbon output, but do not proportionally reduce the reliance on upstream Scope 3 emissions. Firms increase outsourcing following a sudden increase in state legislative pressure. Implies that demand shocks do not increase absolute emissions, just emissions along the upstream supply abroad, so increasing the robustness of their original findings. Outsourcing is stronger in firms for higher stronger in firms from high emitting industries, and firms are more likely to outsource to countries with weak environmental laws. The internal mechanisms increase carbon outsourcing in order to protect self-interests. External mechanisms decrease carbon outsourcing as they have a more global view of decarbonisation. The more firms import, the less likely they are to engage in green innovation. Firms with larger amounts of imported and upstream Scope 3 emissions have higher levels of reputational risk, and the market sufficiently prices Scope 1 emissions, but not its imported Scope 3 emissions. So a very large range of findings that sort of covers from A to Z across this spectrum. So the strengths of the paper. So the paper is extremely empirically sound. The endogeneity issues are all addressed every time that I thought of a possible endogeneity issue or a possible issue was addressed by the authors. So they've done a really strong put forward a really strong case there. Additionally, the entire story is evaluated. How firms are doing it, what's driving them to do it, which firms are doing it, and what are the consequences. So just going through the strengths again, all the endogeneity concerns are addressed. The use of multiple models assessing the interaction effects alleviates many endogeneity concerns. The use of exogenous shocks to increase the robustness of their findings, and the use of multiple proxies as well instead of just the one proxy really it makes the paper airtight. So building on that, the empirical methodology is extremely solid. And then going another strength is the large breadth of data. There's data pulled from multiple different sources on a large number of variables, and the comprising of this data set is really one of the great strengths of the paper, and subsequently allows for the entire story to be evaluated, which really alleviates multiple endogeneity concerns and makes the paper much stronger. Finally, it's got solid contribution. So this is obviously a massive issue. My paper talks about science-based targets, but as Lilian pointed out too, for Procter & Gamble, that's only addressing such a small percentage of their actual emissions. So a massively growing issue that's going to need to be addressed as we move towards the Paris climate goals as a globe. The first paper to address how a firm tackles climate change. The first paper to provide direct evidence of the substitution effect between produced emissions and outsourced pollution. So areas for future improvement. Empirically, I have little comments on how to further the empirical analysis. As I said, the multiple use of proxies and exogenous shocks and breadth of issues covered increase the empirical validity and makes it an extremely airtight paper. Personally, I would like to see the analysis of the years prior to 2015 incorporated into the main paper. I know it's in the internet appendix. One of the concerns I had when reading was obviously the measurement of Scope 3 has increased in recent years and how that affected our results. Just a brief inclusion of that into the paper would maybe alleviate that concern for other readers and academics of the paper as well. Explanation of the high R-squared numbers or potential for more analysis on absolute US emissions. And potentially a question for Lilian is, have you guys looked at firms where carbon neutral options are more available? The high emitting firms, as you said, were more likely to outsource, but obviously there's some industries where there isn't that many carbon neutral options or emissions reductions options. So maybe looking at industries where it's been identified that there is carbon neutral options and see what US firms are doing in terms of outsourcing in that sort of arena. One of the main issues I had with the paper, not an issue really, just a minor critique, was the language around the description of the role of imports. It makes sense when you are explaining it there, Lilian, you explained it really well. However, in the paper, a more detailed description of the role imports play in the relationship may help explain the relationship. I think it's a small couple of sentences, maybe just a bit of a broader explanation on how the relationship sort of works, just so that the empirical results are easy to interpret. And then when communicating the results of the interaction impact of imports, some of the language is vague and bidirectional. So words like augment, distort, they sort of fail to describe the actual relationship, again, make it hard to understand that role of imports. So maybe more specific language around that. Other than that, I thought, it was one of the most airtight papers I've read. So congratulations.
Thank you very much, Fraser.
Thank you, Fraser. Now it's time to a question and answers. Anyone has questions?
Lilian wants to answer a comment.
Yeah, from online, do we have anyone?
Lilian wants to respond.
Lilian.
No, Fraser, thank you so much. I think some of the language about I should we should expand more on the imports and describe how imports play a role in reducing the or increasing the substitutional effect between scope 1 and 3 emissions. Thank you.
No worries.
Do you have any specific answer for the extremely high R square there?
Because we have so many combination of fixed effects, the fixed effects pretty much, I mean, the high R square pretty much capture the fixed effects that we have in there.
Yeah, maybe driven by the trends. You may check the retrended variables and the models.
Sorry, say that again. I can't hear you.
The relationships may be driven by the trends in the variables, common trends.
The trend in the variable, which is unlikely because we use the log as well. The results still, the log will take care of the trend that we have, because the trend is just a total emissions in terms of raw numbers. So natural log should be able to take care of the time trend.
Okay, so it's up to the questions and answers now.
So sorry, I was sending Fraser an email so during parts of your presentation, but I mean the number of firms reporting scope 3 has been going up, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, but at the same time, how can you separate the number of firms increasingly reporting and the substitution effect?
So the number of firms that have increased is actually starting from 2015. Right after the Paris Accord, that Trucost wanted to cover more firms in their sample. So as Fraser correctly pointed out, is that what we try to do is we remove beyond 2015 because the number of firms has increased dramatically at that point, and then focus on the sample period before 2015 and the results still hold. Okay. So the results not driven by the number, the increase in the number of firms.
Yeah. I think including that in the main paper, just as a brief thing, it's not in the main paper; it's in the internet appendix, isn't it?
Right. It is. No, it is in a footnote. We have the results in the appendix, but we did not. We do have the results.
Yeah. Okay.
Because we have too many tables already and too long.
Yeah.
Hey Lilian, thank you for your presentation. I had a question around the data you used for the scope 1, 2, and 3. So do you use true cost? Are you purely using the sort of disclosed emissions data, or are you using estimated emissions as well?
Okay, I listened to Trucost head of the S&P Global Head of Sustainability. He was explaining to us how accurate Trucost data is, i.e. that when the company provide them their data, scope 1, 2, and 3, they will have their own model to estimate it. And sometimes there is a slight deviation. They will send the data back to the firm and say, look, my estimation is different from yours. Can you reconcile that? So in that sense, I think the quality of the data is very high. After I listened to the head of the S&P Global describing how they construct the database. So what we have is we do not have the distinction between disclosed and reported. So we just use whatever that was given to us by Trucost.
Yeah, because I think that's quite important, especially, understanding how they've estimated those emissions, because there's a few different ways that data providers are doing that. And I think it can lead to quite big differences from what I've seen.
Right, there's a paper actually by Ashwin Raghunandan and Raj Gopal that they try to describe the Trucost data estimated versus disclosed. And in my opinion, I'm not sure whether it is actually driven by that yet, because the people who, it's very different for ESG ratings. The ratings are very different. But in terms of emissions, it's going to be harder for the differentiation because they have satellite device that measure the amount of emissions produced by firm. So that part, I think, is much more accurate. The only problem is the scope 3 emissions, because scope 3 emissions are coming from suppliers. So what they do is that they estimate it by the product they have, the manufacturer, and they estimate how much the emission will be produced by the materials that they import from their suppliers. Have I answered your question?
Right. Thank you, Lilian. If you have more questions, you can contact Lilian and yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the
Thank you.
opportunity to present my work. Thank you.